This sermon came from actually last year at Townsville, at the camp there. I was presenting the morning Bible studies each morning, and this happens to be half of one sermon that you got, the front half of it, before I went up there about 18 months ago. And now you're getting the back half of it because the two are connected, and I think you're going to see this. And so here you see the connection is actually from John Wycliffe to Jan Hus. And this was the leading photo I used on that series. And I've put here the English pronunciation. What I've actually done here is I've looked at the story of Huss, and I've tried to find out of this story something which is, I guess, relevant for us, because there's so much in the story of Huss. And so I tried to break this down to the part that would probably be relevant to us. So the context of the story is Prague and Constance. So you can see Prague is actually today what's known as the Czech Republic. All right? Used to be Czechoslovakia. Go back to Huss's time, it was actually Bohemia. All right? And you can see that Prague is the capital there. And then across Germany, down on the border between Germany and Switzerland is Constance. That's where our story with Huss will complete. Now, what I'd like to do is, just as a part of the process of becoming familiar with the context of it, I thought I'd just throw up a couple of pictures of, if you go to a trip for Prague, young people everywhere love travelling in Prague. And not all the things that I'm throwing up on the screen necessarily appealing to young people, but it shows that there's a lot of young people around in Prague. They enjoy Prague. It's a great tourist destination. The bridge that you've been looking at here with the people crossing over the bridge is filled with sculptures and musicians and artworks, and you could take half a day just going across the bridge. But there's lots of other things to see in cathedrals, in chapels, etc., and around the street, certainly just picking up some of the energy of the people today in the city of Prague. So that's the context of the city. Now, let me say to you that when you come to this memorial, which is sitting right in the middle of the old city square, which you saw just a moment ago, it's a very large memorial, and it reveals the full history of the Hussite story. I say that because you'll notice it's in two parts. One photograph here is looking at the front, where you can see on the left there's Huss standing very tall, representing the peak of the Hussite movement and what he brought to the people of Prague in his short lifetime. The other end of that, or at the back of it, it's more obvious to see that the Hussite movement lasted about 200 years in Prague and in the Czech Republic, etc., or Bohemia. And while that's great, one of the things that happened at the end, while they, for example, 10 years after Huss, there were 5 attempts to just totally annihilate the Hussite movement through these, I guess the church sent out military armies trying to defeat. Ziska, who you'll see a little bit later on, was a general, blind part of his time, when he actually led the Hussite people, and they had victory after victory as they continued to put their trust in God. Almost sounds like biblical stories, you know, David's against Goliath, etc. But one by one, those armies were put down, and they survived and continued till, guess what happened? About 200 years after Huss. They compromised with the church in order to have peace. And let me suggest that that's about the first illustration you want to pick up today, is compromising means defeat. And that's what happened to the Hussite movement, and this is represented by this very large monument. Okay, now let's get the history side of it in terms of the dating of it, the chronology of the story of Huss. How long ago was he? Where did he fit in? So I've taken you to my favourite photo, the Martin Luther monument in Worms. And here you see Martin Luther standing very tall on the statue. And seated around Martin Luther there are 4 individuals. These 4 individuals represent the forerunners of the Reformation. Now, guess who 2 of them are, right in the middle? there is John Wycliffe, and underneath him there is Jan Hus in the 14th and beginning of the 15th century. They were forerunners leading to the work of Martin Luther. And here is a timeline. I know some of you love a timeline, so I've just put it all onto a timeline so you get a little bit of an idea of the proportion and placing of them alongside Luther, Zwingli and Calvin. The Waldenses, or Peter Waldo, they go back earlier than what the diagram shows, the arrow perhaps to indicate that. But let's have a look at the story of Jan Hus. So we've picked up that his story is, he starts at the end of the 14th century, but it's really when he gets into right at the beginning, or in the transition between the 14th and 15th century, that's when his influence is really felt. You can see that he only lived a very short life, 45 years. But he made an enormous impact, and it's greatly appreciated. He was born in a country town called Husseneck. The name Husseneck is tied up with the word goose. It's going to be a play on words in a minute, and you'll see that. He uses it as a play on words himself. He accepts the fact that he's a bit of a goose in the eyes of some, but you'll see in a moment how he uses it. And his father died at an early age, but his mother saw the value of education, and she did all she could to get him into education. And you can see at the age of 10, he was sent to a monastery for his schooling. And then in 1390, he heads to Prague from the country, and here he begins training for the priesthood. Now, as he is training for the priesthood, it is interesting to recognise that I guess he started right from the beginning, training as a priest, but within a few short years, he not only was qualified to be a priest, but he had a Bachelor of Theology, he had a master's degree, and was into his doctorate. And by this stage, he was well and truly being picked up by the university to become a lecturer himself. And so by the time we come to the date of about 1921, and I think that comes up on the next slide. No, I'm sorry. It's in 1401, he's promoted to actually be the Dean of Philosophy, head of philosophy and theology in the university at such a young age. And 2 years later, he becomes the rector of the Carolinum, or Charles, that's the local name for Charles, University. And right outside the office of the university, there's a plaque there, and if you can pick it up, the little white line in the middle of the plaque is underlining the name of Jan Hus and the contribution he made as one of the greats in the history of the university. So in his very short time, he makes a big impact. So remember this, first of all, he's working in the university, and by this stage, he is onto these truths of the Bible that up till this stage of his life really hadn't been a part of his life. Let's keep going with his story though. I want to look at the influences upon Huss. The first and greatest influence upon Huss is John Wycliffe. Now, this is when those of you who are sitting at the front, you can read the fine print if you want. Those of you at the back, I hope you can see the blue line and a couple of others there. But what I want to point out is right at the top, there is John Wycliffe, the top blue line. And then you'll notice before John Wycliffe finishes his life and ministry, Jan Hus is born. But he didn't know Wycliffe. And it wasn't until afterwards that he begins to come to grips with what Wycliffe has been teaching through Wycliffe's students. Now, how did that happen? Well, that basically happened because in the time of Huss, there was a queen on the throne, Sophia of Bavaria, who was the sister-in-law to the queen who was on the throne, or not on the throne, she was actually wife to Richard II, and she was, Richard II's wife was actually the older sibling of Wenceslas IV, who's the husband of now her queen, Sophia. You're lost, aren't you? Yeah, it took me a long time to get hold of that too. In fact, that's the only note, would you believe, the only note I wrote down in case I got stuck was it, but you can But I think you got it, so good. All right, so here we have this connection through the royal family that the message of Huss was passed on. First of all, through the students. Let's go on a bit further. For example, it's the students of Huss. Some of, by the way, when Anne of Bavaria, when she came over, no, I've got that Bavaria part wrong. See, I knew I had to rest on it. It is Anne of Bohemia. That's the area of where Huss is, of course. When she went over to be queen, she took a lot of the young people, students, across to the Oxford University. Who's lecturing at the Oxford University? Wycliffe. And so when they finished their studies, and by this stage it gives a chance for Huss to grow up and be old enough to be taking it in, there these students came across with their influence of Wycliffe's teachings. One of the first things that drew Huss's attention to the Reformation thinking was the fact that there were two students who got up to preach, but they were banned. And so they thought, well, we're also artists. And they got another idea. They went into a public place and they painted two pictures. One picture was of Christ, and look, I'll go to this one here because this is a more accurate description of it that comes later. One picture involved Christ who comes riding on a donkey, humbly entering Jerusalem. The second picture was of the pontiff, the papal pope, riding on a horse with all his paraphernalia and a great train or an entourage coming along behind him. All right? That left a strong message in a lot of people's minds. It was a strong message in Huss's mind. And it's where his thinking started turning over. And by about this stage, Huss has become, and we'll come to, I'll keep that for a moment, another student is Jerome. Now, Jerome, he was in fact, he was a better academic than was Huss. And he had been to Oxford and had been influenced by Wycliffe. And so when he came along and became one of the closest friends, these two were buddies right throughout the ministry time that they had together in Prague. In fact, in the end, Jerome will come to Constance to die with Huss. All right? That's how close these two men were. He was a great influence and shared much of the Wycliffe teachings and writings came from this man as well. And here are the collection. I didn't realise that when they've collected up all his bits and pieces and these handwritten documents and so on and bound them up together, look at almost a library in itself of what Wycliffe wrote about Reformation thinking. And so obviously these writings, which had come to him through the students, through the royal family even, he is starting to value and beginning to see the value of the truth that it's revealing that become what we know as Reformation thinking or theology. Now, my final point here for the major influence upon Huss is the attachment to the royal court. Because, okay, we've found now he's barely been at the university 10 years as a student, 12 years actually, and he's the rector of the university. He's in charge, running the show. And it was actually the year before this that he is appointed as the chaplain of the royal family, and also he is confessor to Sophia, the queen, who, remember, she is sister-in-law to the queen who was in England, who was a strong supporter of Wycliffe over there. And so while she probably didn't have a direct communication because of the age and the generational difference, nevertheless, she was very sympathetic to what she was receiving. And now Huss is in the receiving, so those chaplain visits and sermons and all the rest that were being shared there with the royal family, they were really on to Reformation theology. And so Wenceslaus IV and Sophia became strong supporters of Huss for many years to come. Perhaps at the end, Wenceslaus sort of weakened a bit on the support he should have given to Huss, but Sophia was a strong support to him right through his years and his ministry, and certainly protected him in various situations with his ability to share. Now, here's another important thing that takes place in the life of Huss. He's not only the rector, he's not only the head of theology, he's not only running the university, but he's also chaplain to the royal family. And in addition to that, this chapel, known as the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, it was designed and built only a decade or two before Huss, and its purpose was so that good theologians, but of course this was from the church, could come and preach in the vernacular that people could understand, rather than when they go to the church, that was in Latin, and often they didn't understand, but it was important to be there, to take of the symbols and so on. But they were more than symbols to them, weren't they? But anyway, so he becomes the appointed dean of the Bethlehem Chapel, which means he was now a regular speaker at the chapel. And this is where the people start flocking in, and by this stage, his concept of truth is really coming together, and he's, we would regard him as a full-blown, early reformer, a forerunner to Martin Luther. Inside the chapel, in fact, this chapel, while you don't see a fraction of the chairs here, actually can seat 3,000 people. It was a big building, and he often had that completely packed out, just preaching to them about the Gospels, the Gospel message, etc. Around the walls, there are some paintings. You'll see one or two of those prop up a little bit later on. And they, of course, are of a later origin, reflecting the story of Huss and the Hussite movement, etc., is reflected in those paintings around the chapel. All right. Now, we need to have a look at then, what were the sort of the theological positions, the positions of truth that Huss actually took. The first thing that he took, and by the way, you'll notice with these first two, they come up every reformer I've spoken about or talked about, we talk about that they accept that the authority of the Bible is the ultimate authority over any other authority, including the church, including the Pope, the head of the church. That the Bible is our authority for what is truth and what is right and wrong. Because I've laboured that long and hard before, I'm going to move on to the next one, which I've also laboured long and hard, and I won't be long on this one. The second point he raised is really the second pillar of Protestantism, isn't it? And that is that the evangelical gospel is how we are saved. It's not about what we do or any performance or pilgrimage or buying indulgences. It's not about anything like that as far as salvation is concerned. It is all about what Christ has done. And he has paid for your salvation. And he's now giving it to you as a free gift, no strings attached. That's the evangelical gospel that this man got onto and began speaking about very, very clearly, very powerfully actually. And so there's the major two pillars of Protestantism right there. Now, the next point is really kind of a blending of those two. Huss urged his followers not to seek Christ in miraculous signs, but in the Scriptures. Now remember, for them, the miraculous signs were, for example, people were making claims that the bread was producing blood. Actually, that was a miracle. And because of that miracle they claimed, they believed. Well, the interesting thing is that while Huss attacked this position strongly, it came about because the Archbishop, now remember, Huss is he's still in the church. He hasn't yet been forced out or made a separation from the church. And the Archbishop recognised, the intelligence of this man and what a great, speaker he was, and he would be good to be appointed as the person who goes around to the various churches and examines these claims of the miracles taking place in the churches, whether it was a statue on the wall that was weeping blood, or whether, as I said, the communion bread that was turning into blood or producing blood, etc. As a result of doing this job, he became strongly opposed to the power that the people were putting in these miraculous signs. And so what he actually did was he ended up writing a book opposing what the church had commissioned him to do, to go and support and to find these miraculous signs. And he said, It's not in the miracles. It's not the signs. It's not your answered prayers, if I can start to bring this into our context, that is the basis of our faith and our relationship to God, but rather it's putting our faith in the Word of God, in the Scriptures. Now, of course, as soon as you hear that, you think, he's on his favourite theme again, outside the Reformation. But this time I've got a reformer who's plugging it, as well as myself. So I'm going to, just for a moment, I'm going to take you to one part of John, and you'll have a good chance to look at this in great detail next quarter, because we shift from Mark into the Gospel of John in our lesson study. And the whole book of John really, I see as is an attempt for the author here to get this new audience to understand it is not about the miracles of Jesus that develops faith. And he shows in a series of stories who some people believe because they see the miracle, but other people have a deeper or progress onto another level of faith where they can believe in the words of Jesus without the sign, without the miracle. Because this was a church now, a couple of generations later, that no longer had Jesus around, no longer had been present to see the miracles and the signs being done. And so in their case, what they were dependent on was to receive the word from other, verbally at first, written later. We have the word, it's called the Scriptures. There's one story here just that I love. It's a story in John chapter 4. And you know it probably fairly well. Let me just go to the next one, which summarises the verse. John 4 and verse 42. You remember the Samaritan woman had been at the well with Jesus, and Jesus revealed to her secret past. 5 husbands, and you're living with somebody now who's not. And she saw that as a miraculous sign. And she raced back to the villagers, come and see a man who told me everything I did. Now, she saw that, what Jesus telling the unknown to her. I mean, she knew it, but she thought no one else knew it. And here's Jesus telling her, she saw that as a miracle. And she starts to believe because of what Jesus had revealed to her, this miraculous understanding. Well, she gets back and she tells the villagers, and first they come out and they listen, and eventually they get Jesus to stay. And then in verse 42 it says, then they said to the woman, we no longer believe just because of what you said. What did she say? Jesus does miracles. He told me all the secrets of my mind and my life. They don't believe on that basis any longer. We have now heard this man for ourselves that he really is the Saviour of the world. They'd only heard him, hadn't seen any more miracles, and they believed on the basis of what he said. And you'll get story after story after story in the Gospels that puts that kind of emphasis through. This is what Huss was on about as well. Us coming to the place where the words of Jesus, we have it in the Scriptures, are of greater evidence to us in our Christian life and our journey than the miraculous. Right, there's the Bible study. Let's come back to the story again of Huss. Here's something else he did. He gave the cup to the people. Now, prior to Wycliffe, remember, and Huss got this from Wycliffe, but prior to Wycliffe and Huss, when the church held communion, it was only the priest who actually partook of the emblems and experienced the wine turning into the blood and the bread turning into the body of Christ. The congregation just had to sit out there and accept it, whereas they never partook of it. Whereas Huss across Europe exploded the teaching, no, we will all share in the emblems. And initially, yes, it was just one big cup and you all came and had a little sip each, all right? And the bread was passed out likewise. But at least the cup became, in fact, it became so important to the Hussite people that it actually became represented as their symbol for the Hussite movement in the years to follow. For example, here on the statue that we've been talking about, notice in the second picture there, the black arrow pointing out from where that picture of Huss is holding a communion cup, all right? Let me give you a couple of other illustrations. This church, by the way, the Church of Tyne in Prague, right there in the old city square, initially it was a Catholic church. when the Hussite movement took over and became the predominant force, church-wise, throughout Prague, it turned into a Hussite church. And right up there, see where the white arrow is coming from? Right between the steeples, there was this big plaque today. And after the Hussite movement, it went back to becoming a Catholic church again. So they took down the golden cup that was up there, representing the Hussite people. They took it down, melted the gold, and made a Madonna standing on the moon, etc., and put that up there in place of the cup. So it's interesting that once there, when that was a Hussite church for 200 years, the cup was the symbol right at the top of the church in gold. That's how important and central they saw it. Here's Ziska, by the way. I won't tell you his story. We haven't got time for that. But notice where the white arrow is pointing, right there at the back. This is the National Monument for Independence right in Prague. You can walk up to it. And behind it, there is a display of these bronze plaques that tell the story of great historical victories that the people of Bohemia and in more recent times as well have received at the hand of their armies. Their greatest warrior was Ziska, the Hussite. And look, there were several actually of the bronze plaques that depicted Hussite battles. Notice in this particular one, the Hussite leader there holds the cup up to rally the troops to get into it. And you can see that it becomes very central in the experience of the people, the importance of the communion and the cup for everybody to partake of. Even the flag, the banner that they carried into battle, had on it the symbol of the cup. So that became a fairly significant symbol and part of the Reformation. Now, we come to the second part of this. The fifth point of what he does, and that is that he attacked the church for its corruption, and it was seen particularly between the clergy and also right up to the top, the corruption that was in the church with the popes, the election of the popes, simony, that they would buy these positions, etc. And there was a lot of corruption there. And Huss was not afraid to speak out against it. But it meant, eventually, his demise. And just to illustrate this, for example, I'll go back to this map or timeline that not everybody's going to see, but you will notice that down the bottom here, see, here's the popes coming out from back in the time of Huss. The 7 years of Babylonian captivity, there were 7 popes who ruled from Avignon in France rather than in Rome. And then right here in the year 1378, so it's right there at the time of the end of John Wycliffe's life, because one of the things he was challenging the church about at that stage is you've got 2 popes. There was one in Rome and there was one in Avignon. But by the time we come to the end of Huss's life, look, we've got 3 popes. And they all are claiming to be the right pope and the others are anti-popes. And they were raising money to go out and battle against one another. And it was just incredible what was happening there, right at the head of the church. And this gave Huss a lot of fuel for what he was saying. However, word came out several times. In fact, 4 times Huss had to leave Prague till things quietened down again. There were papal bulls and excommunications and all kinds of things coming out for Huss from the Pope, until finally what happened was this man, Sigismund, who was the king of Bohemia and later becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, he wants to have settled this papal schism that we were showing you there. And in addition to that, he wants to suppress heresy, so he arranges to make sure Huss is called in. And in addition to that, he's going to reform the church. Pretty good thing coming from a secular leader, so to speak. And so the Council of Constance was called. And this is where we pointed out before on the map, and you see a different map here now. But the Council of the Constance, the township inside the red circle, actually sits on top of the Lake Constance, separating part of Germany, part of Switzerland. It's about 60 plus kilometres long and about 14 kilometres wide. It's a big lake. And Constance sits right on that boundary, and he calls all the faithful in. And this is where they come in. Very picturesque area. The gardens here, right there. There's a wharf nearby. And this is a nice place to be. This particular building, known as the council building, so to speak, today, it was the major building where the meetings were held. There's one big floor that's open. Other areas, there's compartments and lots of things are used. This has been used for over the years. It's even been used as a warehouse for the harbour just across the way that we'll see in a moment. Now, this is interesting. Besides the monarchs, the Pope, and their respective entourages, it is reported that in attendance at the beginning of the Council of Constance, so we're now talking at 1414, the first, but by the way, when you notice the dates from 1414 to 1418, they didn't stay there all the time. They came in for weeks of meeting, go back home, come back. It sounds like a session almost, doesn't it? But it's obviously quite different than that. So in addition to all those people there at the council, there were 18,000 ranking clergy. That included 20 cardinals and 80 bishops. There were 300 theologians. There were 24,000 soldiers and hordes of ordinary people. And look, there wasn't room on the page to put another one, and you might see why I didn't want to particularly put it up. But there were 15,000 women of ill repute who were brought in. And it wasn't just for you might look at the list and say, soldiers. No. Have a look at this. Here in the harbour, right out in the centre, just in the centre there's a revolving statue, and you see it more clearly now, of a woman standing there with her hands outstretched, and she just revolves around, takes about 5 minutes to go right around. And in one hand, notice on the right-hand side, it's the Pope, the church, sitting. And in the other hand, she holds the monarchy. So you can see why Huss had a lot of fuel for his purpose, didn't he? And this became very evident, and he used all this as a part of what was happening. Down the street, by the way, just a couple of hundred metres away from the harbour, there's a triple-headed peacock there. And this represents the popes, or the anti-popes at the time of the Council of Constance. And there's the name of them. And I haven't got time to go through each of their stories, but they are interesting. Let me go just to the last one, if I may. He was the one who became the third of the two lines of popes. Pope John the 23rd, I think, isn't he? Yes, the 23rd. He was the only one of the three popes who actually was brave enough to come to the Council of Constance, because they all realised their necks were on the line, and one of the things that Sigismund wanted to sort out was not having three popes but one, and they all feared that their job was at stake. But Pope John came in, and he came in with an amazing entourage of people, and in great display and cheers by the people. And the reality was that, yes, he got all the accolades, but do you know what? Within a year, he was in the same prison as Jan Hus. And he had been caught because he had been trying to escape from Constance. He could see the writing on the wall. So he disguised himself as a postman, got on the local barge or river cruise, whatever it might have been, and went down the Rhine, and he was off. But someone recognised him as the Pope, not the postman, and it was reported. They caught up with him. He was placed into prison, and so ended his role as Pope. And so one by one, each of those popes were actually replaced. In fact, all three of them were replaced by, there's a plaque there on that council building that I showed you before, and the plaque says that it's Martin V, Pope Martin V, who becomes the one to replace them. So that part of the council was quite successful. Right, when Huss arrives in Constance, here's his story very quickly. His first involvement, he has about a month of freedom. Sigismund actually gave him a ticket of freedom. You could come in, nobody could touch you. Come into the council. And so he came in and he freely walked around till about a fortnight later. Suddenly he realises that he's been made a captive, a prisoner, and for about another fortnight he has some quite nice accommodation. But here in the church, right in the aisle, but down the bottom of the aisle, was where they set up the area where he would be judged and dealt with. Back in the council hall, other matters and decisions were happening back there, a bit like the big tent and the smaller pavilions or the kitchen, when it's session time, isn't it? But anyway, here it is. This is where the trials were taking place for Huss. And it became very evident right at the outset that he was in strife. And by the way, over a period of almost, 8 months before he meets his demise there in Constance, over that period, he was tried on several occasions, both at the beginning, and I think they must have gone away and come back again and pulled him out of prison again. But here is where he stayed. For example, this building today is the Insel Hotel. It used to be a Dominican monastery. The plaque on the bottom there with it black underlined actually says Dominican monastery and gives the dates for it. And the dates go right back actually to 1414. All right. And perhaps recognising even the fact that, this is where Huss is held for the first period of time. In fact, he was there in this prison for 3.5 months in a dungeon. He wasn't up there with a nice window view. He was in the dungeon, and it literally is, yes, you can see the lake behind the cars there. It was basically at sea level, lake level, and that would have meant those dungeons were very damp, dungy. In fact, the artist has put a rat or two in there in the picture as well. They were not a healthy place. In fact, before the 3.5 months are up, Huss was so ill that he actually had to call for medical help, and it was the Pope's doctor who came and attended to him and saw to him that he get a better place. So they took him out and took him to the Gottelben Castle, which is right on the Rhine, the exit of the river out of the lake, and it was right there where he was placed in another dungeon, right down underneath the castle, but this is where he was held. At the same time was John the 23rd was in the same prison here for a period of time. And so this was probably no better not much better anyway, we should say, than the first dungeon that he spent for his imprisonment. But he eventually came out with only about 2 weeks before he eventually was sent to the stake, and he came back and he went into his last trial. Before he went it was in between these, he had several meetings of trials during this fortnight, and he had this dream one night that he had walked back down in Prague to the Bethlehem Chapel and gone inside the Bethlehem Chapel, and you'll notice my attempt to put graffiti over the artwork. All the artwork was covered in graffiti, and it was dungy and dark and most depressing. And he really felt depressed by this part of the dream. But later in the evening, he goes back there again, and this time the chapel in his dream is bright and cheerful, and all the artwork is back in its full glory again. And he took that as evidence from God that God had given him a dream. Yep, you're at the dark point, but beyond you, there's a very bright future coming. And so when he went to his trial, he was very happy still to be identified with the side of truth. So here he is, and look, I just now want to make this very quick to finish with because our time has gone. He's in trial, and it's interesting to notice here, in his very last day of his trial, where he had been accused of being a Wycliffite, interesting term, 30 false charges were presented against him, including this one: Huss was the fourth person of the Godhead. I mean, where do they get all this stuff from? But anyway, these were the kind of accusations they were making up against him. And his answer was always, prove me wrong by the scriptures. If you can prove me wrong by the scriptures, I'll believe you and recant. Well, finally the day comes when obviously he is sent to the stake. And here's where this word goose comes into it. He says, you are going to roast me. This is while he's right there about to be burnt at the stake. You know, the piles of timber and wood are all around him, and it's about to be lit when he says, you are now going to roast me because I'm a goose. But behind me there will come a swan who will sing and whom you will not be able to burn. Everybody saw that as a prophecy that behind him would come a swan, and that swan was Martin Luther, because Martin Luther was accused of being a Hussite. The connection goes on, doesn't it? And by the way, there's another statement about Huss on the way to trial before he even got to Prague. He said, look, I'll probably cook like a goose. He said, but I'm prepared to cook like a goose because I'm standing for truth. And it did not worry him where he was going. This is from Great Controversy. I'd just like to read these words as they are to give you a little bit of an idea here. When the flames kindled about him, he began to sing, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me. And so continued until his voice was silenced forever. Even his enemies were struck with his heroic bearing. When the body of Huss had been wholly consumed, his ashes were gathered up and cast into the Rhine, and thus borne onwards to the ocean. His persecutors vainly imagined that they had rooted out the truths he preached. Little did they dream that the ashes that day, borne away to the sea, were to be seed scattered in all the countries of the earth. It would yield abundant fruit in the witness for the truth. And I want to say, thank God for the Husses of this world who were prepared to stand for the truth that we're able to partake of today. And again, I'm sorry for the small font on this. It's just a photograph I picked up out of the internet, and it says, seek the truth, listen to the truth, teach the truth, love the truth, abide by the truth, and defend the truth until death. That was another recorded statement of Huss towards the end of his life. What a wonderful life. And the monument that actually there is just in the city of Prague today. You can go to the very place where he was burnt at the stake. And on the other side of it, by the way, there is a monument to Jerome, where he too was burnt at the stake a year later. Same spot for the same things. What they stood for and what they prepared to give their life for, I thank God for that enormous inheritance that we have. Oh Jesus, we trust you. We thank you for your word. And may that word ever bring us into a relationship with you, and a continued relationship with you is our prayer we ask today in his worthy name. Amen.